Welcome to the Cybersecurity Vault. I'm your host, Matthew Rosenquist, cybersecurity strategist and CISO at Eclipse. Today, we're going to talk about the ethical risks of privacy. My guest is Reid Blackman, and Reid is the founder and CEO of Virtue Consultants, an AI ethical risk consultancy. He's also the author of a new book, Ethical Machines, as well as the former professor of philosophy at Colgate University and research fellow at UNC Chapel Hill. And I've worked with Reid in the past, and trust me when I say he's absolutely brilliant, and I love debating things like this with him. So today's podcast is created in part by Eclipse, securing data in transit through any cloud, network, or device. Welcome, Reid. Thank you for coming and talking today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, the problem is I'm already intimidated because your podcast voice is obviously better than mine.
It's my only advantage.
It's very good. It's very good. I've got nothing.
Okay, so ethics, privacy. Is there always a risk when we're talking? Is there an ethical risk when it comes to privacy? Give me your insights.
Is there an ethical risk when it comes to privacy? Yeah, look, I take it that all else equal, if there's a violation of privacy, then something ethically wrong has occurred. It's an ethical bad. Someone's probably done something ethically wrong. Someone may be blameworthy for things having gone wrong. So yeah, of course, if there's a violation of privacy, then there's an ethical issue on the table. I take it that privacy concerns are a subset of all ethical concerns.
So what are those big challenges? I mean, what are the big risks if we have privacy, from a technology perspective, is being undermined, or regulations aren't being followed, or basic human rights or something like that? Where is the technology world right now, and what are those risks to our end users?
All right, so I'll articulate the sort of what I take to be two of the, is this right? I think two of the major risks, at least on one account of why these things are ethically problematic. As I sort of told you before, I'm not sure that I agree with the mainstream way of thinking about privacy, but I can talk mainstream conception of privacy or ethical conceptions of privacy. And then if we want to poke around, if that's really the best way to think about it, we can do that. All right, so let's think about in the context of AI or machine learning in particular, because that sort of, there's a way in which, I think this is fair to say, that that data ethics is a subset of machine learning ethics, insofar as all machine learning requires a tremendous amount of data. So the ethical issues that pertain to machine learning will surely include, among other things, the ethical issues that pertain to data. All right, so you're in an organization, you're either procuring machine learning or AI solutions, you're designing them in-house. If you're going to do that, you're going to need a tremendous amount of data. Now, often that data is about me and you and everybody else in the world. It's about people. Not always. Sometimes it's about what your dog looks like, but oftentimes it's data about people. And it could be the case that possession of that data, as such, constitutes a violation of someone's privacy. So just the fact that the organization has that data means that, or entails that, or it constitutes violating someone's privacy. Why would it constitute a violation of privacy? To take the most take a standard approach. It's because maybe you don't have my informed consent to have that data. So that's one way in which there's a potential privacy violation, because having data about me in a way that doesn't violate my privacy requires that I first give you my informed consent to acquire that data in the first place. That's a standard line, not the only standard line, it's a standard line. So if you're doing machine learning, then you are highly incentivized to gather as much data about people as you can, all else equal, because all else equal, the more data you have, the more accurate your machine learning model is going to be. Okay, that's one place where machine learning starts to push against concerns around privacy.
And are you talking about the training aspect of those algorithms, or are you talking about the operation of those systems in gathering data?
Yeah, I'm talking about training, about how you
Okay, so training, not necessarily the inference stuff, just simply the training the algorithms. Got it.
Yeah, you want to create, what's machine learning? It's just learning by example. That's at the concept level, that's all machine learning is. It's learning by example. Pretty simple, everyone can understand that. If you want a really fancy word for example, the word data will do it. So data is a fancy word for example. And so what does it mean when you have software that learns by example? It means you have software that learns by data. So all else equal, forget about computers for a second. you and I, the more examples you give us, the better we'll learn the thing that we're supposed to be learning, whatever it is. And same thing with the software or the algorithm, if you like. The more examples or the more data you give it, all else equal, the better. So that means that organizations are highly incentivized to hoover up as much data as they can, even if they don't know exactly what they're going to do with it, because one day it might become relevant to training a machine learning model. So there's a way in which, the way that I like to put it is that it's the nature of the beast of machine learning, that it calls for get more data, right? Screwdrivers don't do that. Screwdriver is a tool that doesn't say get more data. Machine learning models say, hey, the fuel of me is data, so go get a bunch of it. So data engineers, data scientists are incentivized to get as much data as they can so that they can build a successful model, but being incentivized to gather as much data as you can very easily lead you to overlooking the privacy concerns that are involved in collecting that data, let alone using the data. So that's, if you like, that's the input side of machine learning, right? The input, the training data. Then there's the output stuff. What's the output? It's inferred data. It's predictions about people. And so it can be the case that you, obviously, if the machine learning model or the AI is worth anything at all, it's giving you some knowledge that you didn't have before, or it's giving you some data that you didn't have before. And it might be the case that you have some training data, let's say data set A and data set B, and there's no violation of privacy there. But when you infer C from data sets A and B using machine learning, it might be the case that possession of that piece of data itself constitutes a violation of privacy. So the example that I like to give here is, let's say you've got permission to have data about people's geolocation. You also just have data about the addresses of therapists. And you put that together into your machine learning model, and you can predict, you say something like, Reid goes to this address every Wednesday at 3:30, and that is also the address of a therapist. So now we know that, new fact we know, Reid sees a therapist every Wednesday, whatever I said, Thursday at 3:30, and sees this person. And even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that having those initial data sets about my geolocation and addresses of therapists does not constitute a violation of privacy, it's arguably the case that the inferred data, the possession of the inferred data itself constitutes a violation of privacy, because now you know something quite intimate about me.
And that can extend, right? That deriving that information can, lead systems to be able to tell, what race you are, what religion you are, what sex or sexual preferences, what medical conditions you might have. And all of those are absolutely considered private data, something that can be used against people, and people have a right to decide who should know. So these AI systems are incredibly powerful potentially in deriving data that wasn't explicitly allowed, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
whose
right.
responsibility is to make sure that they don't do that, right?
Yeah.
How do we fix this?
I mean, look, there's lots of things to say, and it's not as though it's going to be, it's the person who's responsible. So look, you could talk about things like there's a senior executive. It might vary by organization. With my clients, it tends to be someone like the chief data officer, chief analytics officer, when we're talking about an AI ethical risk program or a responsible AI program. Of course, there are privacy officers that could be chief privacy officer. But different senior executives are going to be responsible for implementing the right kinds of standards cross-organizationally. And that's going to affect not just the data scientists and the data engineers, but also it's going to affect people like you, the cybersecurity people. Because, look, what is cybersecurity in the business of doing? And you tell me if I've got this wrong. You're in the business of making sure that the people who ought to have access to certain data do in fact have access, and the people who ought not to have access, in fact, do not have access to the data. So that includes, are the systems set up from a cybersecurity perspective to make sure that the data engineers and the data scientists have access to the data that they ought to have access to, and do not have access to the data that they ought not to have access to when they're looking to train their machine learning models. So it's going to require a cross-functional team that goes from everyone from, say, the CISO and the chief data officer, chief information officer, chief technology officer, down to those sort of, more in the weeds data engineers, some data scientists, whoever the weedy people, whatever you call the weedy people in cybersecurity, I don't know what you call them, cybersecurity engineers, it's going to require all those people. when something goes sideways and you ask the question, who's responsible for things going sideways, then it's generally going to be a senior executive who was relatively, I mean, in this day and age, knowing what we know, at this point, you're either negligent or reckless if you don't have the proper procedures in place.
Well, in the cybersecurity world, right, we tend not to be relevant until something bad happens. And, I see that with my privacy colleagues as well, because we have to work very, very closely together for the reasons you mentioned and other reasons as well, including even if you do have the legitimate right, let's say you are a healthcare company and you are managing people's healthcare records, yes, you were supposed to have access to it, but I also have to protect against people outside, right? The external, attackers that are coming in and potentially getting access or exposing or whatnot. But this whole process, I would assume, should not be a bolt on, right? Understanding the ethical ramifications of what data you should have and what you're deriving should not be an afterthought, right? Tell me if I'm correct. It really should be embedded in the overall architecture before systems are even built to understand what they should be holding, what they shouldn't, what are the guidelines, what are the procedures, what are the guardrails so that the wrong data isn't allowed in and the wrong, I guess, outputs are not derived. Is that a requirement, or is this something that post review normally for applications? Let's see what it's doing, and then we'll put in controls. Where? When?
Okay, so I take it there are two questions. One is, should we be proactive about this instead of reactive? That's the first question. The second question is, does this have to wind its way through the entirety of the organization? Those are great. Those are easy questions to answer. Of course, look. If it were,
I'm here to throw you softballs. Yeah,
right.
sure. I'm saving the tough questions later.
Look, ethically, of course, you should be proactive, right? So there's a question about what's the force of the should. Ethically, should you? Yeah, of course, because there are real risks that harm people, wrong people, put peoples at risk, and all else equal, that's an ethically bad thing, so don't do it. There's also, of course, maybe not of course, but there's, I think, a clear business case, at least by way of reputational risk. So you don't want to be in the news media or social media for having a massive data breach. It's not a good look. It's not a good look, and your marketing people are going to be really unhappy, and your PR people, your communications people will be really unhappy because you may have spent lots of time building up trust, but as we all know, trust is very easy to destroy. You can spend, just forget about organizations. Think about personally. You spend 20 years, 30 years, you're loyal to your spouse, and then you have an affair. Well, now trust is out the window. Even though you had 20 good years, that one incident really did a lot of damage. It does a lot of damage, and it's the same thing with organizations, right? It could be their first breach, but if it's a significant breach, that's a significant breach of trust, not just of your data wall, so to speak, and that's really hard to undo. So I think there's very good both ethical and business reason to do it. And then, of course, we've got regulatory requirements around things like GDPR and CCPA and making sure that those privacy regulations are upheld. And then we have new regulations coming out of the EU and Canada. So, there's also regulatory reasons, which are in turn business reasons. Okay, so should you be proactive about it? Yes. In fact, as I said, I think at this point, knowing what we know, seeing all the hacks that we've seen, seeing all the ethical breaches that we've seen, it's negligent, if not reckless at this point, not to do something proactive. So that's that. In fact, it might not be proactive. It might not be reactive to a particular incident within your organization, but at this point, it's reactive to the general landscape of risks that are actual, present, that have manifested many, many times. Okay, how's that so far?
It's good. I mean, from a trust perspective, we always say we earn it in drips and we lose it in buckets, unfortunately.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so enough of the easy questions because let's take it down to a practical level in the industry. If we've got senior executives and they're working on an on an AI engine, a product using AI, or anything else that's going to be harvesting large amounts of data, in their mindset, typically it's about, are we going to make money? How do we maximize profit, right, over investment? And you've got the engineers now that are thinking more of, can we do this? Is it possible? And I'm wondering, where is that squeaky little voice that needs to say, should we be doing this? So my question to you is, in the industry, in what you're seeing, how pervasive are companies and organizations, large and small, realizing what they need to do when it comes to ethics and privacy and actually doing it?
Yeah, not many. Not many.
I don't like that answer.
No,
Not
okay.
many.
I mean,
So
I don't.
tell me why. Tell me, how
Yeah,
does this change? Tell me, if we continue down this path, me as the individual consumer that may have my private data either harvested,
yeah,
used, stolen, or derived,
yeah.
what do I do? So help me out.
Okay, so look, there's basically there's three levers of varying power. Lever number one, appealing to, if you like, the inner conscience of a bunch of senior execs at multinationals.
Who see dollar signs? Who talk in dollar signs? Yeah. Okay.
I will say, I don't want to vilify the senior executives. They're under often real pressures. I mean, there are villains. Of course, there are villains. There's villains. But there's also good people who are under real pressures, business needs, blah, blah, blah. Competing, limited resources. There's always, political infighting might be a bit strong, but there's political jockeying. And so it's not easy to do. So you could be a really good person amongst a sea, if not a sea, at least a pond of senior executives who have other priorities. So you can appeal to the conscience thing. It gets you some way. It's a lever. It's not, in my estimation, a particularly strong lever. So that's one. Lever number two, reputational risk. As I mentioned earlier, listen, we've got a big brand. We are known nationally, internationally, etc. And we have real competitors. And if people don't trust us because they think we're playing fast and loose with their data generally, or fast and loose with our AI, whatever it happens to be, then they're gonna go elsewhere. That's not true for everyone, right? Like, Google's not worried about Bing. They're just not worried. But most companies, most organizations are not Google, right? They're the exception, not the rule. So there are very real reputational risks that can actually harm your bottom line because your consumers or your clients, if we're talking B2B, will just go elsewhere because they don't trust you for good reason. So there's reputational risk. I think that's another lever. And then the third major lever, there are other levers, I suppose, but the third major lever is regulation. Or regulatory preparedness. So we know, obviously, we've got GDPR, we have the EU AI Act coming out, not too distant future, could pass in the matter of a few months even. It wouldn't come into effect for, I think, something like 2 years until it's actually passed. But facing real fines out of Europe is a real thing. Canada is working on its own regulations with the AI and Data Act. That's a real thing. So, and then you throw into the mix that these are requirements on multinationals, and we're talking essentially about organizational change, which does not happen, overnight within a multinational organization. You better get on it now, because if you don't get on it now, you're not going to be compliant with regulations when they actually come into enforcement. So I think those are the three major levers. Yes, there are others like junior people pushing their senior people to take the stuff seriously, and so as a matter of something like as a part of a strategy for employee retention and employer branding, there's a piece there. In general, I like to say that every individual and organization is a kind of cocktail of motivations. There's never the reason that they do something. There's a bunch of reasons. And different individuals, their cocktails, so to speak, have different ratios of this or that ingredient, whether it's they care about ethics for its own sake, or they want to do the right thing, or they see it as a brand advantage, or they want to avoid the reputational risk, or it's really just their own ego and they want to be known as a person who spearheaded the ethics campaign, the AI ethics campaign, or whatever it is at their organization. There are those people, and that's fine. Frankly, I don't really care about their motivational constitution as long as we can, move forward and avoid doing the wrong thing.
The privacy folks have an uphill battle. And again, they're right next to me in cybersecurity, and we work so closely together. We cry often. Um, do you think that they are not leveraging as part of their arguments, because they've got lots of arguments for privacy, the ethical aspects enough about why privacy is important? Do you think they focus too much on those regulatory issues and regulatory compliance and even liability? We've seen lawsuits and whatnot come in that can be stinging, as well as brand. Are the privacy people missing the boat here, and they should also have those ethical arguments and discussions in their toolbox?
Yeah, of course. Of course. Look, there's not going to be a silver bullet for these kinds of things. And like I said, different senior people, senior executives are going to have different motivational constitutions. And so for this one, they couldn't care less about the ethics stuff. They just don't care. But reputation, they care a lot about. This other one is not so persnickety about reputation because they think, yeah, we'll be fine marketing long term. But actually, can we just do the right thing, please? Right? So any what is it? Any arrow in the quiver? Is that an expression? Feels like
Yeah.
an expression.
Any arrow in the quiver. That
Yeah,
works.
any arrow in the quiver, and there's more than one. Yeah, I honestly think the best arguments are the ones that you can't give. It's the occurrences. It's the Cambridge Analyticas, right? Like, what makes what really drove awareness around data privacy? Was it an argument someone gave about ethics? No, it was Cambridge Analytica and the massive impacts that had, or at least arguably had. That's what's going to push people forward the most on the ethics side of stuff. You give examples like that, the more examples like that happen, the stronger the argument comes because you don't want to be those people.
And you bring up a great example because, in that case, there were executives at the time that thought this would be fine. And they may not have seen any ethical red flags, let's just say, with doing that type of business and selling that type of data to this business partner. So, we all live in the moment. We all believe something is ethical at any given moment, per se. How do we make sure, or how do we improve the moral compass for people to be more, united and more aligned with some kind of structure or framework? Is there something that the business world or regulation should mandate to get us all kind of focused on a similar picture of what is ethical versus not?
Okay, so there's a number of things to say here. So if you're talking about, okay, we're an organization, let's say we're a large organization, how do we set our ethical standards? So let's just pull apart two questions, which you're not confusing at all. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, including our listeners. There's what are the ethical risks that we want to avoid, and then there's how do we do it. That is to say, how do we systematically avoid those risks? So let's put the how do we avoid the stuff to the side. That's essentially a question about what does good governance look like. So let's put that to the side. And then there's your question, I take it, is something like, I would call it a content question as opposed to a structure question. Structure pertains to how do we systematically identify and mitigate the ethical risks of AI, for instance, whereas content refers to what are the ethical risks that we want to avoid and what are their sources? What are the sources of those risks? That's the content side. So this is a content question, which I like. Okay. There's at least two kinds of things. So first of all, we don't all have to have the same ethical standards. Any more than individuals all have to have the same ethical standards. You and I probably have overlap in our ethical standards, and we probably have some places where we don't overlap. In general, say, think about political ideologies. You've got people on the left, you've got people on the right, and while there are some crazies on the left and some crazies on the right, there's a bunch of not unreasonable political positions that people hold that are not compatible with each other, right? So there's someone on the left, someone on the right. Neither one of them is crazy. They're fully reasonable, but they've got a reasonable disagreement about, say, what constitutes justice or what the best direction for the country is, blah, blah, blah. And so we should allow the same things with organizations, which is to say, they don't all have to have exactly the same ethical standards. They've got to be in some kind of acceptable within the boundaries of reason, right? I take it that regulations are meant to spell out, when they're done well anyway, they're meant to spell out that boundary of the reasonable versus the unreasonable. Within the reasonable views, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let different organizations have different ethical standards. So you can have your Hobby Lobbies and you can have your Patagonias. That's cool. I don't think we need to say no more. We can't have either one of those anymore. I don't think that's the place of regulation. So long as both are within reasonable regulatory guardrails. Okay, so now you're an organization. You say, of course we're going to play by the regulatory and legal rules. We're going to do that, but that still leaves a lot of ethical space. What do we do? And I think there are generally two kinds of things to do in terms of specifying what your ethical standards are. The first is an ethics statement. Now, I think it's really important, though, that the ethics statement is not fluff, because then it's nothing. If you just say you're for fairness, my favorite example of we're for fairness is the KKK. If you write a piece of paper that says we're for fairness, the KKK will say, yeah, we'll sign that. They are for fairness in that, abstract of a articulation. Therefore, they just have a very different conception about what, operationalizing that looks like. So I think one, you state your ethics statement in terms of your own ethical guardrails. So for instance, because we value X, we will always Y and we will never Z. To give you a toy example that speaks to privacy stuff, because we value privacy, we will never sell your data to a third party. For example, right? Now when they say they value my privacy, oh, I get it. What they mean by that is there's this particular thing that they will never do. They will never sell my data to a third party. Now, you want to fill it out more than that. Privacy is more than just about whether you sell the data to a third party or not. There's lots of other considerations, of course, about what respecting privacy might consist in. But you can imagine that there's a range of reasonable positions about what constitutes respecting people's privacy, all within the bounds of legality and good regulation. And different organizations are going to have different guardrails. Some will sell that data to a third party, but only after aggregating and anonymizing with the lowest probability they can manage to handle, or the best threshold. That once it's reached a certain threshold of probability of not being de-anonymized, something along those lines, right? So there's different moves, as it were, that one can make. But so step one, guardrails. Step two is what I like to call ethical case law. So we've actually done this together. When you're working with organizations on what their ethical guardrails are, there's some things that 80, 90% of them are on board, and they're like, yeah, that is a line that we're not going to pass. Oh, great, put that in the ethics statement. There are some where it's almost 50-50. There's just deep disagreement about what to do here, and I like to take those statements, put them to the side, and then once we're done with the ethics statement, we say, okay, you know what we have now? Now we've got a bunch of gray area cases where there's a lack of internal alignment. Now we're going to work through those gray areas, those tough cases. It's not going to go to a public-facing ethics statement. It's going to be internal, but it's going to be internal case law. We're going to decide where the organization stands on these gray issue areas. We're going to work through it. Not everyone's going to be happy with the solution, but we need to get internal alignment, or it's going to create friction down the line. And you work through that, and that becomes your ethical case law. So then when a new case presents itself, you can say, okay, well, this is tough. This is a gray area case. Our principles, our guardrails are kind of silent on it. It's not clear how to apply our higher level guardrails or principles to this particular case. Let's consult how we decided certain gray area issues and see how the current real situation compares against our reasoning and decisions with that ethical case law that we created. So in this way, it's analogous to legal case law. So I think when organizations do that, it's a phenomenally powerful tool in aiding their deliberations when the new case is on their doorstep and there are dollar signs flashing in their eyes, because now they've got something at least that they can try to be consistent with, specifically the judgments they made on that ethical case law.
Got it. So you've got to create that framework, starting with the baseline. Okay, at minimum, we're going to meet regulatory controls, and then let's step up and say, for our organization, we're going to have very specific other guardrails of the, precisely what and the relevance of that with examples. And that goes into that public facing privacy statement. And then you've got the gray areas where you kind of have to decide internally, and that probably changes. And it sounds like you need to have a process and maybe even a group that coordinates that and revisits that to figure out what you're going to do internally. Not necessarily a public facing thing, but it's internally on what will we do, especially when you see dollar signs. If we just grab that data, we could make $1 billion. Okay, right? So have those controls.
So remember, that's the other question, though. Remember I said early, there's the how are we going to do it, and there's what are the standards. So all I've done so far is specified what the standards are. How you implement those standards and how you update them in response to changing market environments, changing technologies, changing culture, et cetera, that's a different kind of question. That's a question about what does governance look like, given that we've defined the standards as we have.
And that can vary hugely, I assume, based on the type of company, where you're operating, the type of technology that you're using, the expectation of customers, all that kind of stuff, integration with third party and whatnot. Uh, I want to go back to this public facing policy because it sounds a lot like your privacy policy, right? Now, every company has to have a privacy policy out on their webpage. And should there also be an ethics policy additional to the privacy policy out there? Is this something that's missing or something that companies should be considering? They need to be out there, especially if they're dealing with any type of sensitive data.
I like to stay away. I know I'm supposed to be the philosopher, so I think the stereotype is that I'm committed to absolutes or something like that, but that's not true. Look, there are reasons for having it public facing. There can be good reasons for an organization to have something like an ethics statement public facing. There could be good reasons for not having it. Whether a company ought to overall make a kind of ethics statement public, it's going to depend upon their particular organization, the circumstances, the context, blah, 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 blah. Should it be required by regulations or something like that? I mean, fine, on the condition that it's actually, the regulations also cover what it looks like to make sure that it's not just PR and that there's actual substance to the statement and that the substance articulates things like
accountability. They can be held accountable for meeting that statement.
Right, exactly. Otherwise, they can just sort of, put out a statement that says, we're for
we're good.
All the just
we're
things.
good. We're just going to do the right thing.
Right.
Really?
So, to me, making an ethics statement public it's a way of achieving something else. It's not intrinsically good to tell people. Like you just go around telling. If you went going around saying like, "Hey, Reid, here's my ethical standards," and you sort of gave me a piece of paper, and you'd be like, "Okay, this is well, thanks for this." I don't know why you gave this to me.
But if someone's going out to my website, they are wanting to do some kind of engagement with me. So, I would say yes, having a privacy policy is important. Having a security policy, I think, is important, and I think having an ethical policy. But you said there are some companies where that specifically does not make sense. Give me an example. Help me understand.
There are instrumental. So when I'm thinking about should people do it, one of the ways I'm hearing that question as an ethicist is it ethically obligatory to do that sort of thing? And I think that's not ethically obligatory to do that sort of thing. There might be various instrumental reasons for doing it, like it increases trust, or it allows people, it allows us to hold them accountable. So there's certain instrumental reasons for doing it. And so, yeah, I'm generally in support of it, but I wouldn't say that someone's doing something ethically wrong simply by the fact that they're not transparent with their ethics statement, right? Maybe they're not transparent with their ethics statement, but their ethical house is in order, way more than the people who are really loud about it, right? So they might be the quiet virtuous type instead of the loud charlatan, the loud virtue signaler.
But wouldn't that be a warning sign? I mean, if a house really is ethical, right, and they've committed, they've got the frameworks, that this is their mindset, why wouldn't they put out an ethical statement, right? Because I'm thinking the omission of one is more of not a red flag, but a yellow flag.
So look, that is becoming the case. So 5 years, if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would tell you what other companies told me, which is things like, if we put a statement out there that says we're really committed to ethics, yada, 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 that's putting a target on our backs for journalists who are looking for us to trip up and want to publish something bad about us, like we didn't live up to our own ethical standards. We want to avoid that reputational risk, so we're not going to put that out there. And I thought, okay, that's not a crazy position. I get that. Journalists need a good story. It's always a good story when a massive multinational company with a big brand falls short of its own stated ethical standards. That's a nice story, and you don't want to be the target. So okay, I get that. I care much more about you getting your ethical house in order than I do about you telling everyone that your ethical house is in order. Now, fast forward to now, is it more of a yellow flag now? Yes, because now the expectations are changing. Since especially things like Cambridge Analytica, yeah, consumers, businesses, citizens, governments are looking more and more to see if companies have their technological ethical house in order. And part of that means telling us, hey, what are your standards and what are you doing? And so there's a way in which the changing expectations have made it the case that if they're not a little bit more, a little louder about it than they had to be 5 years ago, then yeah, it's a risk. In the same way that it's a risk for non-technology issues, right? So, you know, take the latest social political issue that companies are expected to take a stand on. I mean, if they didn't say anything about, I don't know, diversity 15 years ago, no problem. You say nothing about diversity now, that's a bad look. That's a bad look.
Yeah, agreed. And we saw that exact kind of series of events, those same dominoes falling in cybersecurity. You look 20 years ago, and companies said, no, we don't want to talk about cybersecurity, what we have, what we don't, because if we do publish something about how we secure our environment, people are going to come after us. News companies are going to come after us. But that also extended, unfortunately, when there was a data breach or there was, oh no, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to publish that. We might lose trust, right? It may be a negative news story. Well, of course you're going to lose trust. Of course it's going to be a negative news story. You lost the data, right? And the industry has evolved to go, wait a second, wait a second. If we allow people to be quiet, they will be quiet in ways that are also detrimental to the customers that they serve. And I think we saw the same thing roll out in privacy. And I think we're on that same road for ethics because there are expectations. I mean, we all kind of have ethical expectations of any transaction or business that we do, right? It's just human nature. But if we can't trust and they're not willing to talk about that, or we're not demanding it, is it really there?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I like to put things out just slightly differently, which is to say that, look, you don't need to earn the trust of your clients. I think that's too hard. That's too strong. Like, I know Apple's big on privacy. Do I trust Apple? I don't know. I don't distrust them. I think, I think what companies should be striving for is they should, we want to make sure that we give them no reason to distrust us. That's it. Not to distrust. It's not like, I trust my wife, right? I trust my parents. I don't trust Apple. Even if I think, trust is such a big, I don't know, big word, such a big sort of like emotional commitment. No. You got to avoid generating distrust. And it's absolutely the case that one way to generate lots of distrust now is to engage in ethically suspect behavior. Even if you don't intend to, because your AI went sideways, for instance, or because there was a breach by a hacker, or a bunch of hackers, right? So there's tons of ways to generate distrust, tons of it, and so yeah, being transparent about what you're doing is one way to make it the case that you don't lose or don't generate distrust. But you are also, it's a risk, frankly, because you can go out there and say, hey, these are our standards. We really believe X and Y and Z. But then if it's just PR, it is true. If you don't get your ethical house in order now, those statements don't mean anything. They actually do damage to you.
Right. They become caustic, right? You've made a
promises.
statement and you're not following through on it.
Yeah, they're promises that you make. If you want to really destroy trust, make a broken promise or break a promise. So I do think, another reason that those statements are useful, again, not intrinsically ethically important or something like that, but one reason why those public-facing ethics statements are useful is that it's something by which the organization itself can pull the political levers to say, hey, listen, we made this promise publicly, and we are now at risk of breaking that promise. And there's another lever for getting people who weren't initially on board to getting on board. It's a little bit sneaky, but it's a way.
So then let me ask you this, because it sounds like there's, the answer is it depends. And I hate that answer. That's the total lawyer answer. So if you're going to do business, or let's say you visit Apple's website, right? You're visiting Apple's website. Do you really need to trust Apple? Probably not, right? You're not providing anything. But if Apple asks you to put in your credit card number, if they ask you to upload a picture, if they ask you to be able to track your location, now to me, that's a different situation. Now there needs to be trust, and they're asking for it. I see the field I have to fill out or the file I have to upload. And at that point in my mind, that's where, you know what, you need to have a privacy statement, you need to have a security statement, you need to have an ethical statement, because I sure as heck want to know. I need to. And I may not be savvy enough as a consumer, but I should be. And to me, that's that delineating factor. The moment we're going to share or they're going to have private data from me or anyone, that's when that ethical statement really should be there. And those guardrails and everything that backs it up should be there.
Maybe one reason why I mean, you have a much stronger opinion about this than I do, about the necessity of it. Not it's reasonable. Um, I wonder if one reason is that you think that it's a way for consumers, to do it enables a consumer to do their due diligence in figuring out whether they should trust this company with all the data that you just mentioned, right, and more.
It is, because I think consumers right now are on a learning curve. They didn't know anything about security, nor did they care until bad things happened. They didn't care about privacy until bad things happened. And I think when we look at ethics, which covers a lot of all of that, I think they're not going to care until something really bad happens, right? Cambridge Analytica, something really bad happened. But if that then downward spiraled to something even worse, yeah, the greater the impact, the more relevance. But I think the average person doesn't think about ethics, just like they didn't think about privacy, and 30 years ago they didn't think about security.
They don't really think about it now. They sort of like they can say some of the words like they can say the word cybersecurity now. They couldn't say the word 10 years ago. I don't think they really know what it means.
No, but they know when they get the letter of the breach of their data. They know that. They know when they see the screen of ransomware and all their files are locked. They know it. They're like, oh crap.
Well, that's when they start learning. Really, that's when they're like, "Oh shit, I should probably learn. I should call Matt, and he can teach me about what the heck is going on here." Um, Look, I have you have much more faith or confidence or something like that in the average consumer that I do, that they're educatable and that the goal is to educate them. I sort of like they should be vaguely aware of these issues. Aware of the headlines would be sufficient. Honestly, if they just know data breach here, data breach there, and but I kind of think about it the way that I think about fraud, like frauds with credit cards or something like that, or the kinds of regulations that financial services companies have to abide by so that I, as a consumer, am not defrauded. I don't know what those regulations are. I don't know I don't know all the kinds of nefarious things that they could do that they don't do because regulations are in place. And I don't want to really know. I don't want to study credit card regulations and educate myself as a consumer what what something like what responsible credit card generation or loan lending looks like. I'm a stupid consumer in this area. I'm ignorant, and I just want the government to just identify the really bad stuff and make sure that those companies don't do that really bad stuff to me. I think I think similar things about things like cybersecurity and the ethical risks that pertain to AI. I don't think we need to educate all these people about cybersecurity and AI ethics. Some people think the public needs to learn more about machine learning, and I think, are you out of your mind? Machine learning? No, they don't. No, they don't. They can't. They won't. Forget it. That can't be a necessary hurdle for success. What I want is the right government people to be in place to put in at least the guardrails for good regulations. And then I want senior leadership at organizations to understand the kinds of reputational and regulatory risks and what they need to put in place in order to avoid those things, and then do that stuff and actually operationalize that stuff. Now, that's what I want. Is a public-facing ethics statement an absolutely essential component for that to happen? No, but it's nice to have. So it's a nice to have, not a need to have, and achieving what I take to be the ultimate goal. Making sure that you're a responsible consumer. I mean, Matt, you're a weird guy. You're obsessed with cybersecurity, right? You and three other people, right? But the average consumer, they just need to pick up the kids. They don't have time to look at the privacy policy of any company.
Okay, so let me take a counterpoint to that, because I think, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, when executives are looking at the dollar sign or they're worried about penalties or whatever, right? It's dollars, 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 profitability. I totally get it. I want them to think that way. But one of the major influences to organizations is customers, right? If customers are going to choose them over somebody else, if customers are going to pay money or pay more, right? Your average selling price, your market share, all those kinds of things. It's all dollars, dollars, dollars. And we've been working with the public, and really the bad guys, the attackers, have been doing most of the talking, but the public has now started to understand, we're still growing, that security is important. So if you're going to deal with a company that isn't secure, doesn't respect or invest in security, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you need to look to see at the competitors, because that's becoming a competitive advantage. Now, do they need to know the ACLs on a firewall? Heck no. But they need to know is this company secure and trustworthy? When it comes to privacy and my private data, are they private and are they trustworthy in handling that? And I think that same level of trust for ethics also plays a key role, because it's a differentiator, it is a competitive advantage, and if it manifests that way in the industry, you're now going to have those same executives go, yep, and we need to follow our ethics statement, otherwise we're going to lose market share. Otherwise, our average selling price is going to go down because of demand, or X, Y, and Z. If we just go, no, people aren't going to understand ethics, security, or privacy, that will never be a financial incentive. And that's the way we move mountains.
Yeah, I'm not sure that maybe we don't disagree so much. I mean, look, I certainly think that the average consumer should be aware of the issue, right? They should be aware of just like I am aware of the issue of fraudulent credit cards or scams with credit cards. I'm aware of predatory lending. I don't totally know what it is. I just know that there's agencies of the government involved to make sure that doesn't happen, and then there are internal things that in credit card companies to make sure that they're compliant with those regulations, right? So awareness of the issues, absolutely, and that's why in some broad sense, I love Cambridge Analytica. It did a tremendous amount to raise awareness of the issue, right? It was really useful. It was bad. It was intrinsically bad, but it was instrumentally useful in raising awareness. So yeah, I do think that people should be aware of, there's a major issue having to do with discriminating against black people in AI, for instance, right? So when there's stories about the facial recognition software misidentified a black person as a potential suspect and was unjustly arrested, people should know that stuff so that they can do things like push for politicians who yada yada, and so that they can, when there's a headline that says, favorite brand X, discriminated against all Southeast Asian women with their lending, their lending AI, they can be like, ooh, I understand what that means, and that's awful. I'm not banking with them anymore, right? So yes, high level awareness, yes. That's all we need from the average consumer. I don't think we need the average consumer to take on the responsibility of doing all the vetting themselves, right? How many companies does an average individual interact with on a daily basis? I mean, dozens.
That's too tall of an ask. Nobody wants to do that. Heck, I don't even want to do that, and I'm crazy. So, okay, so last question here. Rolling forward in time and looking at it from that corporate perspective, maybe the regulatory perspective, and maybe that consumer viewpoint, where do you see, what is success in ethics and privacy, AI ethics, all that? What does that look like in the future?
Okay, here's where I think people should be going. So there's lots of talk now about AI ethics or responsible AI. We have regulations, like I said earlier, as you're well aware, regulations coming out of the EU, coming out of California, we have CCPA, of course. We have the AI and Data Act coming out of Canada. So there's stuff coming down the pipeline. I think that we need to broaden our perspective when we're thinking about ethics in general and privacy in particular. I think we need to talk about something like digital ethics, responsible digital innovation, something along those lines, that we need to think more about not just the technologies that are around today, the ones that will be here, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and proactively think about what does regulation or proper governance look like around those technologies. So, for instance, I'm working with a client now who they're not just doing, they are doing the AI ethics bit, but they're doing more generally a digital ethics program, which will encompass not only the AI that they're developing and procuring, but also the AR stuff that they're doing. And while they're not using blockchain for anything right now, or quantum computing for anything right now, 10 years from now, 10 years from now, they very well could. Maybe they'll do VR. They don't do VR right now, but they may very well one day. So creating a governance structure that's flexible enough to take on new, emerging, changing technologies, I think is really, really important. I think that's what success looks like on an organizational level. And at the regulatory level, I think we need regulations that don't target things technology by technology, but take a broader approach to something like data and data-driven products. So that's going to include, of course, just massive data collection, but also machine learning and blockchain and quantum and IoT and yada, 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 yada. So I think that broader approach is what we need. And success looks like robust digital ethical risk programs in the companies that are building the stuff, procuring the stuff, et cetera.
I love it. And all the technologies that you had mentioned, whether it be, AI or quantum or blockchain or whatever, it's all about data, protecting data, or massive amounts of collecting, using, processing, storing data. So looking forward and building structures and continuing to ramp up around all those technologies and not targeting one at a time, right? It makes a lot of sense.
Two more things, and then I'll shut up. One is, it's not just about the data, as you say, it's what you do with the data. I mean, these are all different ways of doing things with data, right? And it turns out that there's all sorts of ways to do nefarious things with data. So putting privacy concerns to the side, let's say you've got the data in a way that doesn't violate people's privacy, there's still all sorts of ways you can go ethically sideways. Okay, that's one thing to say. And all these emerging technologies introduce new fun ways for doing ethically bad things that are also reputationally harmful and potentially regulatory and legally harmful. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing to say is, though, that because they are data-driven products, whenever I sort of list the main ethical risks for a given technology, so for machine learning, we have things like bias and explainability, and for blockchain, there's issues about governance and third-party protections. But for every single one, I have to list privacy. I have to list privacy for every single one because everyone uses data or is storing data.
And of course you say security too, because that's tied in. I'm sure you meant to say privacy and security. Yes.
I mean, I take it that privacy is comprised of a number of elements, one essential element of which is security.
Yes.
No, I do mean that.
I gotta poke people every time they leave that out. So okay.
Oh, I just take it to be, when I think about privacy, I think about three things. Is this right? I think about three things. I think about regulatory compliance, at least compliance with the current regulations. I think about cybersecurity, and then I think about what you might call the ethical perspective of privacy that has to do with the extent to which people should or ought to have control over data that's about them.
That's a good triad to think. That really is. That's a great triad.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Hey, thank you for coming and sharing your insights here. And Reid kind of continues this discussion of ethics of AI in his new book, Ethical Machines, which is out now. So definitely go grab a copy, read it, send him a message, tell him whether you liked it, and advocate for him to write his next book on this, because this topic isn't going away. It's going to get more complex. It's going to get more challenging, especially as we have those new technologies and new expectations and even new violations out there that teach us all. So thank you all for watching. Be sure to subscribe and catch all the Cybersecurity Vault episodes where we chat with industry leaders like Reid to dive into the most relevant and interesting cybersecurity challenges, perspectives, and best practices. Thank you much.